destroying the sacred shrine of the demon. Haunting begins. The story, The Desecration of the Demon Shrine, revolves around a group of villagers who, out of ignorance and arrogance, dare to tear down an ancient shrine dedicated to malevolent spirits. After defiling the sacred space, a series of terrifying, inexplicable events unfold in the small village, leading to horrifying deaths and an eerie atmosphere of dread. At the heart of the chaos is a man named Jake, a local outcast. Jake, despite being warned, takes part in the shrine's destruction and is later possessed by a dark force, driving him to commit unspeakable acts of violence. As the villagers grapple with the growing number of strange occurrences, it becomes evident that the shrine was not merely a relic of the past, but a gateway to something far more sinister. The tragic deaths, the eerie omens, and the descent into madness all point back to the desecration of the shrine, leaving the surviving villagers to confront their own guilt and fear. Their attempts to restore peace are met with little success as the evil presence continues to haunt the village. The chilling climax reveals the true horror of what they have unleashed, with Jake's final, gruesome act serving as a grim reminder of the power of the supernatural. Part 1. The Forgotten Shrine. In a quiet village nestled deep in the hills, life passed with a predictable stillness. The sun rose and set, the seasons changed, and the routines of the villagers remained untouched by time. The village, once bustling with activity, had grown into a sleepy, forgotten place where nothing much ever seemed to happen anymore. That is, until a shadow crept back into the villagers' lives, a shadow they had long avoided, but which had always been lurking at the edges of their world. On the farthest edge of the village, standing on a patch of land where the trees refused to grow, was an old shrine. Time had reduced it to a crumbling, weather-beaten relic, its wooden beams sagging, roof tiles missing, and vines growing unchecked over the structure. Once, many generations ago, this shrine had been a place of reverence, a place where the villagers came to leave offerings, pray, and show respect to the unknown forces that resided within. But that was all forgotten now. No one spoke of the shrine, nor did anyone dare approach it. The villagers kept their distance, driven not by knowledge but by an instinctive fear that something about the shrine was deeply, dangerously wrong. Legends whispered among the old folks, though they were spoken of only in hushed tones behind closed doors. The shrine, they said, was not merely a monument of worship. It was a prison, a place where something dark and unspeakable had been bound long ago. The tales varied. Some spoke of a vengeful spirit trapped inside, others of an ancient demon sealed away for the safety of the village. But no one truly knew, or at least no one alive today remembered. What they did know was this: for as long as the shrine stood, the village had been safe. And so it stood, forgotten but undisturbed. That was until Jake came along. Jake was the kind of man who seemed to carry trouble with him wherever he went. He wasn't evil exactly, just off. From the day he was born, he never quite fit in. He was the sort of person you'd see lurking in the background, avoiding eye contact, his thoughts always somewhere else. If something went missing in the village, people assumed Jake was involved. If there was gossip about some shady deal, Jake's name always came up. He had a knack for making people uneasy, even when he wasn't doing anything wrong. Perhaps it was the way he spoke, always a little too casual, a little too eager, or maybe it was the way he smiled, his lips twisting into something that looked more like a sneer than any real joy. Jake had never done an honest day's work in his life. Most people knew him as a drifter, always scheming, always looking for a way to make a quick buck. But the problem with schemes is that they don't always pan out, and Jake had found himself deeper in debt than he cared to admit. His latest idea, a half-baked attempt at smuggling cheap liquor, had gone sideways, leaving him not only broke but owing money to people who weren't known for their patience. He needed cash fast, and that's when he heard about the shrine. Rumors spread that the village council was planning to tear down the old shrine to make way for a new marketplace, a sign of progress. They said the village needed something to draw in traders, travelers, anyone who could bring a bit of life and money back into the sleepy town. And the shrine, well, it was an eyesore, a relic of the past that no longer served any purpose. The council had made it clear that whoever could demolish it would be handsomely rewarded. Jake had seen an opportunity. Recognition and wealth, two things that had eluded him his entire life. If he could be the one to tear down the shrine, he'd be a hero, someone the village would finally respect. More importantly, he'd have the money to pay off his debts and maybe even start fresh somewhere else. It wasn't like Jake believed in the old stories. Spirits, curses, demons, those were just fairy tales the elders used to keep kids in line. The shrine was just an old building, nothing more. And he, of all people, knew how superstition could blind people to easy money. This was going to be simple. A few swings of a hammer, some wood splintering under his force, and it'd be done. Jake could already imagine the coins in his hands, the way people would look at him differently. No more whispers behind his back. No more sneers from the villagers who thought themselves better than him. So on the appointed day, Jake found himself standing in front of the shrine, a crowbar in one hand, a hammer in the other. The village council had gathered at a safe distance, watching nervously. None of them wanted to be near the shrine, not even the brave ones who scoffed at the idea of spirits. It was as if something unseen pressed against them, warning them to stay away. Jake, on the other hand, felt nothing but impatience. He spat on the ground, adjusted his grip on the hammer, and strode up to the shrine as if it were no different than any other job. He was about to swing when an old man, one of the elders, called out from the group, "Jake, boy, I wouldn't do that if I were you. That place is not like the others." "There are things you don't understand," Jake sneered, waving the warning off. "It's just wood and stone, old man. If there was something inside, don't you think you would have done something by now?" The elder's face darkened. You don't know what you're playing with, but Jake was already swinging. The hammer connected with the wooden beams of the shrine, and a deep, resounding crack echoed through the clearing. For a moment, everything went still. Jake stood there, panting slightly from the exertion, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. He laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "See? Just a bunch of nonsense. Let's get this over with." He continued hammering, each strike louder than the last. The shrine, weakened by years of neglect, didn't stand a chance. The wood splintered and cracked, the stone base crumbled. With each swing, the shrine collapsed a little more, until it was nothing but a pile of debris at Jake's feet. Dust hung thick in the air, and the sound of the hammering still echoed in Jake's ears, though he had already stopped. From the distance, the village council clapped hesitantly, uncertain whether to feel relieved or worried. The shrine was gone, after all. But as the dust settled, a strange feeling began to creep through the clearing. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a faint chill that seemed out of place in the warmth of the afternoon sun. Jake felt it too, though he would never admit it. Something was off. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched, but when he glanced around, the only eyes on him were those of the council members, still standing a good distance away. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, forcing a grin. "Nothing to it," he called out, though his voice sounded hollow in his own ears. He gathered his tools, glancing one last time at the remains of the shrine. The pile of rubble seemed to almost breathe, as if it were alive, though Jake quickly dismissed the thought. He had done what he came to do, and now it was time to collect his reward. But as Jake walked away, something deep beneath the ground, something ancient and long forgotten, stirred for the first time in centuries, and it was angry. Part 2. The Destruction. The morning air was crisp as Jake led the small group of men toward the shrine, his head held high, his steps confident. Around them, the village stirred with the usual quiet murmur of a lazy day. But there was an undercurrent of something else, something tense, heavy, as if the very ground knew what was about to happen. The villagers didn't speak to Jake as he passed. Some of the older ones didn't even look at him. their eyes cast downward in a silent act of avoidance. They knew better than to meddle with the unknown, but Jake had always been different, dismissive of their superstitions and eager for something more than the slow life the village offered. He walked with the air of someone who had already won. In his mind, this was the job that would change everything. No more scraping by, no more small-time schemes. This was the big one. And yet, despite his bravado, there was a tightness in his chest, a whisper at the back of his mind that he couldn't quite shake. It spoke of danger, of things left best alone. But Jake had never listened to warnings before, and he wasn't about to start now. Behind him, the 3 other men he had recruited shuffled their feet nervously. They weren't as brash as Jake, but the promise of a generous reward was enough to drag them out of their beds that morning. They clutched their tools, hammers, crowbars, and axes like they were shields, something to keep the creeping unease at bay. None of them had dared speak of their fears, not openly, but the air between them was thick with it. Every now and then, one would glance toward the shrine, then quickly look away, as if afraid that even acknowledging it would draw its attention. By the time they reached the clearing where the shrine stood, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground. The shrine loomed before them, worn, decayed, and yet still somehow imposing. It wasn't large and no bigger than a small shed, but it carried with it the weight of centuries. The wood, blackened by time, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The roof sagged, threatening to collapse under its own weight, and thick vines crawled up its sides, as if trying to drag it back into the earth. The men paused at the edge of the clearing, unsure of how to proceed. The silence was palpable, pressing in on them from all sides. Even the birds had stopped singing, and the usual hum of insects was nowhere to be heard. The world had gone still, as if holding its breath. For a moment no one moved. The enormity of what they were about to do weighed on them like a physical force. Jake was the first to break the silence, laughing to himself as he stepped forward, breaking the invisible line the others wouldn't dare cross. "It's just an old shack," he said, his voice loud in the eerie stillness. Nothing to be afraid of. The others exchanged uneasy glances but followed him. After all, Jake was in charge, and they didn't want to seem cowardly. But the tightness in their chests only grew as they approached the shrine. It felt wrong, like they were walking towards something that wasn't meant to be touched. And yet, there was no turning back now. Jake raised his crowbar, gripping it tightly. He gave one last glance toward the other men, his expression daring them to challenge him. No one spoke. With a grunt, he swung the crowbar against the wooden door of the shrine. The sound it made wasn't what any of them expected. It wasn't the sharp crack of wood breaking, nor the dull thud of impact. Instead, it was a deep, resonant boom, like a great bell being struck. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath their feet, and for a moment it felt as if the very air had thickened. Jack froze, the crowbar still raised for another swing, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs, as if it were trying to escape his chest. He glanced at the door he had struck. The wood had splintered, but not as much as it should have. It seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly, as if it were part of something larger, something that had only just woken up. "What the hell was that?" one of the men, Tom, muttered under his breath, his eyes wide with fear. Jake shook his head, trying to regain his composure. "It's nothing, just old wood, that's all." But even he didn't believe it. He swung again, harder this time, determined to get this over with. The crowbar connected with the door once more, sending another strange, echoing sound through the clearing. This time, the wood gave way, cracking under the force of the blow. The door sagged inward, revealing the dark, hollow interior of the shrine. Behind him, the other men shuffled uneasily, their faces pale. None of them dared to speak, but the unspoken question hummed in the air between them. "What have we done?" Jack stepped forward, peering into the shrine. The air inside was thick, heavy with a musty scent that clung to his skin. He could barely see anything in the dim light, but something about the interior felt wrong. The shadows seemed to ride there, twisting and shifting as if they were alive. He squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness, but his head began to ache, a dull throb building behind his eyes. Without warning, the ground beneath his feet seemed to drop away for a split second, as if something had shifted deeply below. Jake staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The sensation passed quickly, but it left behind a cold, creeping dread that curled around his spine. I don't like this, Jake Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a step back, his hands gripping the handle of his hammer so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Shut up and keep going, Jake snapped, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. He turned away from the dark interior of the shrine, swinging his crowbar against one of the wooden beams supporting the roof. The beam cracked, groaning as it buckled under the force of the blow. The other men hesitated for a moment longer before joining in, swinging their tools against the shrine's weakened structure. The air around them seemed to grow heavier with each strike, pressing down on them, making it harder to breathe. The silence that had once filled the clearing was replaced by the sound of wood splintering, stone crumbling, and their labored breathing. But underneath it all, there was something else, something they couldn't quite hear, but could feel. A presence, ancient and malevolent, watching them with growing interest. With one final swing, the roof of the shrine caved in, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The men stepped back, coughing as the thick dust choked the air around them. When the dust finally settled, the shrine was nothing more than a pile of broken wood and stone at their feet. Jake stood over the wreckage, panting, his heart racing. For a moment he felt victorious. It was done. The shrine was gone. But as the dust cleared, an eerie stillness settled over the clearing once more. The air was unnaturally cold now, despite the warmth of the sun overhead. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling slightly. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had just done something terrible. The other men were silent, staring at the ruins of the shrine with wide, fearful eyes. None of them dared to speak, but the same thought ran through all of their minds. What have we unleashed? A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a strange, high-pitched sound that set their teeth on edge. It wasn't quite a scream, but it wasn't natural either. The trees around them rustled as if something unseen moved through the branches, watching, waiting. Jake swallowed hard, trying to dismiss the growing sense of unease that twisted in his gut. It's just the wind, he muttered, though the words felt empty, meaningless. Without another word, he turned and began walking back toward the village, his pace faster than before. The others followed, their faces pale, their movements stiff. No one spoke, no one dared to look back. As they left the clearing, the wind died down, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The ruins of the shrine lay still, but beneath the earth something stirred, something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. And now it was awake. Part 3. The first omen. That night, the air in the village was thick with a heaviness no one could quite explain. The destruction of the shrine earlier in the day had left an unsettling ripple through the air, as if something sacred had been violated. The villagers tried to go about their usual routines, but an odd silence clung to everything, even muffling the distant sound of the wind in the trees. The birds, normally lively at dusk, had gone eerily quiet, and the streets, usually filled with soft chatter and the creak of wooden carts, now seemed abandoned. Jake, however, felt an odd sense of accomplishment, though the unease in his chest hadn't fully lifted. The others had hurried home the moment they left the clearing, their faces pale and their eyes avoiding Jake's. He brushed it off, thinking them cowards, scared by old superstitions. He, on the other hand, had faced the unknown and come out victorious. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the silence became more oppressive. His room, dimly lit by the moonlight seeping through the small window, felt colder than it should, and he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching him. His thoughts drifted to the shrine, the weight had crumbled under his hands, as though it had been waiting for that moment. He could still hear the strange echo of his hammer against the wood, that unnatural sound reverberating in his bones. Jake closed his eyes and pulled the covers tighter around him, trying to ignore the feeling that had been gnawing at him all day. But sleep didn't come easily. When it did, he was restless. The dream began subtly, as if he were drifting between waking and sleep. He was standing at the edge of the village, the path that led to the shrine stretching out before him. Everything was bathed in a sickly, pale light, the trees around him casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like dark fingers. The path was empty, but Jake felt the weight of something unseen just beyond his vision. He walked forward, though his legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself were pulling him down. Each step sent a shiver up his spine. The trees whispered around him, voices just on the edge of hearing. They spoke his name soft and sibilant, growing louder as he neared the shrine. Then he saw her. A figure stood at the entrance to the shrine, or rather, where the shrine had been. The ruins were still smoldering, the debris lit by the pale, unnatural glow of the dream. She was gaunt, her skin stretched tighter over bones, her long black hair hanging limp around her shoulders. Her face gaunt, her face was hollow. Her eyes were sunken, dark pits that seemed to stare into Jake's very soul. Though she made no move toward him, her mouth was open, as if she was screaming, but no sound came out. It was the silence that made it worse, the absolute, soul-crushing silence that filled the air as she stood there, her body trembling with the force of her silent wails. She raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at him, her fingers long and gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. Jake wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but his body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of her gaze. The world around him began to blur, the trees and the ground melting away into darkness, leaving only the woman and her silent scream. Her face contorted, her mouth widening impossibly, the skin around her eyes cracking and peeling, revealing the raw flesh beneath. And still no sound, just that awful suffocating silence. Then, without warning, she moved suddenly, violently, her body lurching toward him. Her hollow eyes locked onto his as she reached out, her bony fingers inches from his face. Jake woke with a start, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he frantically looked around his small room. The moonlight still poured in through the window, but everything felt wrong. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been, and the silence. The silence was still there. He could hear nothing, no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of the village, just silence, thick and suffocating. It pressed down on him, wrapping around his chest like a vice. Jake's hand shook as he wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. Just a nightmare, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. Just a stupid nightmare, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something had changed. Something had followed him from the dream into the waking world. The night passed in fits of restless sleep, and when morning finally came, it brought no relief. The sun rose over the village, casting long golden rays over the houses, but the strange tension from the previous day hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened, like the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first sign that something was wrong came when the villagers found the boy. He had been missing since early morning, his mother calling for him from house to house, her voice growing more frantic with each passing minute. It wasn't unusual for children to disappear for a while. They often wandered off to explore the fields or the riverbank. But this was different. This time he hadn't answered any of her calls. By noon, the whole village was searching for him. It was one of the older men who found him near the edge of the clearing where the shrine had stood just a day before. The sight that greeted him stopped his heart. There, lying face up on the ground, was the boy, his body perfectly still, his limbs rigid and cold. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open, staring at something no one else could see. His mouth was twisted into a silent scream, the same kind of scream Jake had seen in his dream. The man who found him recoiled, stumbling back as he shouted for help. Soon, A crowd had gathered, their faces pale as they looked upon the boy's lifeless body. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. This had never happened before. There had never been a death like this, not in their village. The old superstitions they had dismissed for so long came rushing back to them, and their gazes slowly turned toward the place where the shrine had stood. Jake arrived with the others, pushing his way through the crowd until he saw the boy. His stomach twisted violently, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. The boy's face was a mirror of the woman in his dream, the same hollow-eyed terror, the same wide-open mouth, screaming without sound. Jake felt a cold sweat break out along the back of his neck, the hairs on his arms standing on end. This isn't right," someone whispered from behind him. Jake swallowed hard, trying to push the image of the woman from his mind. He couldn't let them see him scared, couldn't let them think he believed in the same superstitions they did. But as he stood there, looking down at the boy's frozen face, he felt the weight of something dark and ancient settle over him. Something that had been disturbed, something that was now watching. "The shrine," a woman murmured, her voice trembling. "It's because of the shrine," no, Jake snapped, more forcefully than he intended. "It's not. The shrine was just an old building. This is just some sort of accident." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. The silence in the air felt alive, pulsing, like it was waiting for something more. The boy was taken away, his body covered hastily with a blanket as his family wept quietly at the edge of the clearing. The crowd dispersed, but the tension didn't fade. It hung over the village like a shroud, thick and oppressive. That night, the village locked their doors earlier than usual. The streets were empty long before sunset, the windows tightly shuttered. Fear had crept into every corner of the village, and though no one said it out loud, they all knew the truth. Something had been set loose when Jake destroyed the shrine. Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, but this time he couldn't even pretend to feel calm. The dream from the night before haunted him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of the woman, her hollow eyes, her silent scream. He kept telling himself it was just a coincidence, that the boy's death had nothing to do with the shrine. But deep down he knew better. There was something out there now, something that had been awakened, and it was coming for them. Part 4. The haunting begins. The days after the boy's death seemed to stretch into eternity. The village, once a quiet and unassuming place, had changed. There was a palpable tension that twisted in the air, a constant, heavy presence that no one could explain. It was as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible. Even the weather had shifted. Where there had once been bright sun and clear skies, there were now dark, rolling clouds, pregnant with the threat of rain, though the storms never came. The air was thick, humid, but carried a biting chill that seeped into the villagers' bones. It was the silence that got to them first. No longer was there the gentle background noise of the village, no children laughing, no chatter between neighbors, no footsteps crunching on the dirt roads. Even the birds seemed to have left. The only sound now was the wind, though it blew in strange, unsettling gusts, whistling through the cracks of doors and windows like a low, mournful wail. That and the whispers. It started small. At first, the whispers were barely audible, like faint murmurs carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent. Villagers began to hear their names being called when no one was around, soft, seductive voices that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them. At night, as they lay in bed, the whispers crept through the walls, filling their ears with strange words that made no sense, words in a language they couldn't understand but could feel deep in their bones, words that filled them with a bone-deep dread. Jack heard them too. At first he brushed it off. The whispers were just in his head, he told himself, a product of his imagination. Guilt perhaps. It was only natural that the village would be on edge after the boy's death, tragic though it was. There had to be an explanation. The shrine had nothing to do with it. It couldn't have. But each night, as the hours crawled toward midnight, The whispers came back, stronger, clearer, calling his name with a sickening intimacy that sent shivers down his spine. And every time he heard them, he was filled with the unshakable feeling that he wasn't alone in his room. One night, the whispers turned into something worse. Jake had been lying in bed, eyes wide open in the suffocating darkness, unable to sleep. The whispers were there, as they always were, swirling through the room, pressing in on him from every corner. His heart was racing, the familiar tightness in his chest making it hard to breathe. But this time, the voices weren't just calling his name, they were laughing. It was a soft, cruel laugh, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, sharper, filling the room like a presence. Jake sat up, cold sweat dripping down the back of his neck. The laugh wasn't just in his head anymore, it was real. He could feel it, as if the sound had weight, as if it were touching him, crawling over his skin. He glanced around the room, his breath quickening. Nothing. The shadows seemed darker than usual, moving ever so slightly, as if they were alive, but there was no one there, no one but him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. His heart stopped. He turned slowly, terrified of what he might see. There, in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadow, was the figure of a woman. She stood perfectly still, her long dark hair hanging limply around her face, her skin pale and tight over her bones. Her eyes, God, those eyes were hollow, black pits, empty yet staring directly at him. She didn't move, she didn't move, she didn't need to. The air around her was charged with an overwhelming sense of decay and death, and Jake could feel it radiating toward him like a cold, wet breath on the back of his neck. It was the woman from his dreams. She was real. Jake couldn't move, couldn't scream. His mouth was dry, his body frozen in place, paralyzed by the icy grip of terror. The woman's mouth twitched, then slowly began to open, wider and wider, as if her jaw was unhinging. Her hollow eyes never left his, and from her throat came that same awful, silent scream. The room seemed to shudder, the walls bending inward as if they were being pulled toward her. A cold gust of wind hit Jake's face, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. His skin crawled as he felt it, her breath. It was real. It was right there. He could feel the cold, rotting air filling his lungs, suffocating him with its foulness. He choked, gasping for air, his vision blurring as his body struggled to respond. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Jake collapsed back onto his bed, his chest heaving as he sucked in air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He scrambled to his feet, throwing open the door to his room and running out into the night, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness of his house. Outside, the village was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind howling through the empty streets. His hand shook violently as he lit a cigarette, the flame from his lighter flickering in the sudden gusts of wind. But even out here, in the open air, he felt it. She was watching him. The next morning, the whispers had spread. Stories began to circulate through the village. Objects were moving on their own chairs, scraping across floors in the middle of the night, windows slamming shut with no wind, doors that locked and unlocked themselves as if controlled by an invisible hand. People spoke of strange, disembodied figures seen at the edge of their vision, only to disappear when they turned to look. Some had begun to feel as if they were constantly being watched, their every movement followed by unseen eyes. In the fields, crops withered overnight, turning brown and brittle without explanation. Livestock became skittish, refusing to enter certain areas of the village, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at nothing. Dogs that had once been friendly now cowered in corners, whining and growling at empty spaces. The villagers were growing increasingly paranoid, whispers of curses and demons becoming louder and more frequent. They avoided the area where the shrine had stood, convinced that the boy's death and the strange occurrences were all linked to the destruction of the shrine. The elders, who had long held their tongues, now spoke openly of the curse they believed had been unleashed. And through it all, Jake could feel her. She was always there, just beyond his sight, lurking in the shadows, watching him with those empty, hollow eyes. No matter where he went, no matter how many lights he left on, the cold, rotting breath was always there, brushing against his neck like a ghostly touch. It drove him mad. His sleep was restless, his nights filled with the same dream, the woman, her mouth open in that terrible silent scream, reaching for him. Each time he woke gasping, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he had been running for miles. But it wasn't just in his sleep anymore. One evening, as he sat alone in his small kitchen, nursing a bottle of whiskey, the lights flickered. He glanced up, irritated. The village had always had a poor electrical system, but this was different. The lights didn't just flicker, they seemed to pulse, growing dimmer and dimmer until the room was almost entirely dark. The temperature dropped suddenly, the warmth of the room replaced by a bitter cold that gnawed at his skin. He stood up, the bottle slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor. His breath came out in visible puffs as he scanned the room, his heart racing. And then he heard it, a whisper, low and insistent, coming from just behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there, only shadows. The whisper grew louder, more voices joining in, swirling around him like a storm of sound. Jake stumbled back, his mind reeling as the voices filled his head, calling his name over and over, mocking him, taunting him. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The kitchen table lurched, one of the chairs sliding across the floor with a loud screech. Jake's stomach twisted, nausea rising in his throat as he backed away, his legs weak beneath him. The chair moved again, this time violently, slamming into the wall with a deafening bang. He ran. Out the door, into the night, his breath coming in short, panic bursts. But no matter how far he ran, how hard he tried to escape, the cold breath followed him, brushing against his skin like the touch of death itself. Her laugh echoed in the wind, that same cruel, mocking laugh he had heard in his room. Jake knew now. He had made a terrible mistake. The woman from his dreams wasn't just a nightmare, she was real. And she wasn't going to stop until she had him. The haunting had only just begun. Part 5. The deaths multiply. The village had been plunged into a darkness that went beyond the lack of sunlight. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed down on everyone, making each breath feel labored, each movement sluggish. The villagers were silent, now silent in a way that was unnatural. The whispers that had once echoed through the streets had given way to something far more sinister. Fear was a living thing, spreading like a disease. It had burrowed into their minds, creeping into every corner, every crevice, leaving no one untouched. And then the deaths began. It started with Tom, one of the men who had helped Jake tear down the shrine. He was found early one morning, his body sprawled across the floor of his small home, a pool of blood spreading slowly beneath him. His throat had been torn open, the flesh ragged and gaping, as though some wild animal had gotten to him. But there was no sign of a struggle, no broken furniture, no overturned chairs. Tom had been a large man, strong and solid, and yet there were no defensive wounds on his hands, no signs that he had even fought back. He had simply died, and his face was twisted into a grotesque mask of terror, his eyes wide open, staring into nothing, frozen in fear. The village was thrown into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of curses and vengeful spirits swirling through the streets, bouncing from one terrified villager to the next. The elders, who had remained quiet for so long, now spoke openly of the curse they believed had been unleashed when the shrine was destroyed. They warned of the consequences of disrespecting the old ways, of disturbing the sacred. They spoke of spirits that had been angered, that now sought retribution. Jake didn't want to hear it. He refused to believe that Tom's death was anything more than a tragic accident. People died. It happened. There had to be a logical explanation. But even as he tried to convince himself, something gnawed at the back of his mind, something dark and insidious that whispered to him in the quiet moments when he was alone. Tom's death had been the first. It wouldn't be the last. A week later, another man from the group, Carl, was found dead in the fields at the edge of the village. His body was discovered by a group of children playing near the tree line. They had seen something strange from a distance, a figure lying unnaturally still in the tall grass, and curiosity had driven them closer. What they found had sent them screaming back to the village, their faces pale, their voices high-pitched with panic. Carl's body was twisted, contorted in a way that seemed impossible for a human being. His arms were bent at unnatural angles, his legs played out awkwardly, as though every bone in his body had been broken. His mouth was wide open, frozen in a silent scream, his eyes bulging, bloodshot and wild. His skin was cold, clammy, and tinged with a sickly blue hue, as though death had claimed him hours earlier, but the terror etched into his features made it seem as though he had died just moments before he was found. The village avoided the area from that point on, and the children were kept indoors, no longer allowed to wander the fields or the woods. There was a growing sense of dread, a belief that something had been unleashed, something they couldn't see but could feel. The villagers had always lived with superstition, with the understanding that there were forces beyond their control. But this was different. This was something far darker, far more personal, and it was coming for them. Jake's world began to shrink. People no longer spoke to him as they once had. They avoided him, their eyes shifting away whenever he approached, as though they feared he carried the curse with him. He was left alone with his thoughts, with the fear that had been creeping in ever since that first night, the night he had seen her, the woman from his dreams. But Jake wasn't ready to admit that something was terribly wrong. He clung to his disbelief like a lifeline, refusing to accept that the deaths were connected to the shrine. Tom and Carl had died, yes, but it had to be coincidence. There was no such thing as curses, no such thing as spirits seeking revenge. He told himself that again and again, hoping that if he repeated it enough, it would drown out the fear gnawing at his insides. But then the third man died. It was Jim this time. Quiet, unassuming Jim, who had barely said a word during the demolition of the shrine, but had done his part nonetheless. He had always kept to himself, a solitary figure on the outskirts of the village, living alone in a small dilapidated house near the river. When he didn't show up at the market for 3 days, the villagers began to whisper. By the 4th day, they sent someone to check on him. What they found was worse than anything they could have imagined. Jim had been torn apart. There was no other way to describe it. His body was strewn across the small, cluttered room, pieces of him scattered in a grotesque display of violence. His head had been ripped from his shoulders, his limbs severed at odd angles, and his torso was barely recognizable, a mangled mess of flesh and bone. Blood covered the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as though something had exploded inside the house, leaving nothing but carnage in its wake. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no doors left ajar. Whatever had killed Jim had done so without leaving a trace. The villagers were horrified, their whispers growing louder, their fear now verging on hysteria. The curse was real, they said. The spirits were angry, and they wouldn't stop until every man who had desecrated the shrine was dead. No one ventured outside after dark anymore. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The village had become a ghost town, the streets empty, the air heavy with dread. And yet, through it all, Jake refused to believe. He spent his days pacing his small house, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The faces of the dead haunted him, their wide, terror-filled eyes following him wherever he went. He saw them in his dreams, too, Tom, Carl, Jim standing in the shadows, silent and accusing. But worse than that was the feeling that she was still with him. The woman, she had been there ever since that first night, always just out of sight, always watching. Jake would wake in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. The air around him would be thick with her presence, that sickly, rotting smell filling his nostrils, the sound of her cold, raspy breath brushing against his neck. He would turn on every light in the house, searching the shadows for her gaunt figure, for those hollow black eyes staring at him. But she was never there, at least not where he could see her. The villagers began to turn against him. It wasn't long before the rumors that Jake had brought the curse upon them, that he had angered the spirits and was now doomed to bring death wherever he went. Some even said he was marked, that it was only a matter of time before the curse took him too. They avoided him in the streets, refused to speak to him, and when they did, it was with thinly veiled hostility. But Jake couldn't run. He couldn't escape what was happening, no matter how much he tried to deny it. The final straw came one evening, just after sunset. Jake had been out in the woods, pacing, trying to clear his head. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the whispers had started again. They were louder this time, more insistent, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. He had tried to ignore them, to push them out of his mind, but they clung to him, growing louder with each step. And then he saw her. She was standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line, her gaunt figure barely visible in the fading light. Her hair hung limply around her face, and her eyes were fixed on him, unblinking. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Jake's heart stopped in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to run, to turn and flee, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the sheer terror that gripped him. The woman's mouth began to open wider and wider until it seemed as though her entire face was splitting in two. Her jaw unhinged, her skin stretched taut over her skull, and from her throat came that same terrible, silent scream. Jake ran. He didn't stop until he was back in the village, his chest burning, his legs shaking. The woman's image burned in his mind, her hollow eyes seared into his brain. There was no escaping it now. The curse was real. The deaths were real. And he knew deep down that his time was running out. But even then, even as fear gnawed at him, Jake couldn't fully admit it. He couldn't let himself believe that he was next. Not yet. He slammed the door of his house shut behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to find a way out. There had to be something he could do to stop it. But the elder's words echoed in his mind, their warnings clear once day. Part 6. Descent into Madness. Jake had always thought of himself as a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or the superstitions that swirled around the old village. He had laughed at the elders when they warned him and his friends about disturbing the ancient shrine. It was just a crumbling relic, an obstacle to progress, a space better suited for the new marketplace. But now, Jake wasn't laughing. He hadn't laughed in weeks. The village had fallen into a tense silence, as though it were holding its breath. The deaths of Tom, Carl, and Jim had left a shadow over everything, and even the most rational people in the village avoided talking about what was happening. They didn't need to say it out loud, the village knew. There was something wrong, something deeply, horribly wrong, and it had started with the shrine. Jake's home had become a prison. He barely left anymore, not because he feared the people outside, but because he feared what was inside. Inside, where the walls seemed to close in on him, where shadows twisted in the corners of his vision, where the whispers never ceased. His one solid grip on reality had begun to slip, his thoughts growing disjointed, fragmented. He no longer slept. How could he, when every time he closed his eyes, the woman was there waiting? At first it had only been in his dreams. She would stand at the edge of his consciousness, her gaunt figure barely visible through the fog of sleep. Her hollow, sunken eyes, black as the void, would bore into him, her thin, pale lips stretched into a silent scream that made his blood turn to ice. But now she followed him everywhere. Even when he was awake, she was there, lurking in the periphery, always watching, always silent. Sometimes she would stand in the corner of his room, her skeletal frame twisted unnaturally, her face contorted in anguish. Other times he would catch a glimpse of her reflection in the windows or mirrors, just for a second, but enough to know she was close, too close. He began to hear her voice. At first it was just a whisper, faint and distant, barely more than the rustling of the wind. But soon the voice grew louder, clearer, more insistent. It was her voice, he was sure of it, but it was different. It wasn't the hollow, breathless whisper he had expected. It was low and rasping, crawling inside his skull, echoing in every corner of his mind. She called to him. She told him things. Dark things. Underscore, they took your life. They stole your peace __ they deserve it. You know they do __ do it, Jake. Do it _ Jake pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but the voice was inside his head now, worming its way through his thoughts, burrowing into his brain like a parasite. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't silence it. The more he resisted, the stronger it grew. She was everywhere inside and out, her presence smothering him like a blanket of darkness. The worst part was the confusion. Jake couldn't tell what was real anymore. His nightmares had begun to bleed into his waking life, blurring the lines between dream and reality. He would hear something, a knock, a whisper, the sound of footsteps, and turn around to find nothing there. But then, a moment later, something would move, something would change, and he would be left wondering if he had imagined it, or if she had truly been there, just a breath away. He would wake up in strange places he didn't remember going. Once, he found himself standing in the woods, at the edge of the village, barefoot and shivering in the cold, his clothes soaked through with sweat. His hands were filthy, covered in dirt and blood, though he couldn't remember how they had gotten that way. Another time, he woke up clutching a knife, his knuckles white from the force of his grip, his mind blank, unable to remember why he was holding it. The voice was with him then too, _ they deserve it. They all deserve it. You know what to do _ Jake tried to fight it. He tried to cling to some semblance of sanity, but the more he resisted, the more the voice pushed. The woman's whispers became a constant, filling every quiet moment with her twisted urgings. She spoke of vengeance, of justice, of the wrongs that had been done, and she wanted him to be her instrument. _ it's their fault. They brought this upon you, upon us. Make them pay _. Jake could feel himself slipping. His reflection in the mirror no longer seemed like his own, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow and sunken like hers. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. The lines between himself and the curse were fading, merging into something else, something darker, something unstoppable. The world outside his home felt hostile. When Jake ventured into the village, he could feel the eyes of the people on him, their whispers growing louder as he passed. They feared him, he could see it in their faces. The children, once curious and playful, now shrank away when he came near, their small faces drawn tight with fear. He heard their parents warn them in hushed voices, their words sharp and accusatory. _ it's him. He brought this upon us. It's his fault _. The villagers had abandoned him, leaving him to drown in the madness that clawed at the edges of his mind. They no longer met his gaze, and when they did, their eyes were filled with suspicion, with fear. He was becoming the thing they whispered about in the dark, the thing they feared would come for them next. Jake could feel the weight of their judgment, could hear the words they dared not say out loud. He was cursed. He had brought this upon them. And yet, even as he felt the weight of their collective fear pressing down on him, Jake couldn't bring himself to leave. He couldn't escape the village, couldn't run from what was happening. The voice wouldn't let him. She wouldn't let him. The nights were the worst. The darkness seemed to seep into his soul, filling every corner of his house with shadows that moved and breathed like living things. He could hear her footsteps now, soft and deliberate, pacing just outside his door. Sometimes they would come closer, stopping just outside his bedroom, and he would lie there, paralyzed, waiting for the door to creak open. But it never did. The whispers never stopped. They followed him into the smallest hours of the night, wrapping around his thoughts like vines, strangling him with their weight. He could hear her breath cold and wet on the back of his neck, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but darkness. The air in his house had become thick with the scent of rot, a smell that clung to him, that filled his lungs and coated his skin. He could taste it, sour and bitter like decay. Jake hadn't spoken to anyone in days. He couldn't. What would he say? How could he say? How could he explain the things he had seen, the things he had felt? He barely understood them himself. His thoughts were fractured, broken into pieces that no longer fit together. He couldn't trust his own mind. He couldn't trust what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. It was all twisted now, warped beyond recognition by the curse that had sunk its claws into him. He tried to focus to gather his thoughts, but the voice was relentless. Underscore, they know, Jake. They know what you did. They'll never forgive you, underscore. Underscore, you have to stop them. You have to end this. Before it's too late, underscore, the voice was louder now, more demanding. It no longer whispered, it shouted, filling his head with its terrible commands. Jake could feel his grip on reality slipping further, could feel the cold claws of madness tightening around him. He was losing control, and the woman with the hollow eyes was taking his place. The nightmares, once confined to the dark corners of his mind, had begun to creep into the daylight. He saw her everywhere now. She followed him through the streets, her gaunt face appearing in the windows of the houses he passed, her voice echoing through the alleys. Her hollow eyes watched him from the shadows, and her thin, bony hands reached for him, always just out of reach, always waiting. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He had to make it stop. He had to silence the voice, had to rid himself of the woman's presence. But how? How could he fight something that wasn't real? How could he escape a curse that had already burrowed its way into his soul? The voice told him there was only one way. Underscore, they'll come for you, Jake. They'll destroy you. You know what you have to do, underscore, make them pay. Make them suffer. Before they make you, underscore, Jake stood in front of the mirror, staring at the man who stared back at him. The man was a stranger now, hollow, broken, consumed by the darkness that had been growing inside him. His eyes, once sharp and filled with life, were now empty, dead. He had become a ghost of himself, a shell hollowed out by fear and paranoia, by the curse that had twisted him beyond recognition. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The voice was louder now, more insistent, urging him, commanding him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Underscore, it's time, Jake. It's time to make it right. You know what to do, underscore, and for the first time, Jake didn't resist. He didn't fight the voice. He let it in, let it fill him with his dark, twisted commands. Because deep down he knew the truth. He had been doomed from the moment they tore down the shrine. With a final, shuddering breath, Jake picked up the knife, and the voice whispered, underscore, make them pay, underscore. Part 7. The Murder. The night it happened, the village lay under a heavy blanket of silence. Even the wind, which had been howling through the trees for days, seemed to still itself in anticipation. The oppressive air that hung over the town had grown thicker, suffocating. The moon, pale and cold, cast an eerie glow over the narrow streets and crooked houses, but its light did nothing to break the darkness that had settled in Jake's soul. Inside his small, dimly lit home, Jake paced the wooden floorboards, his thoughts racing, his mind consumed by the endless whispers. They had become louder, no longer just faint echoes in the back of his head, but a constant, maddening chorus. The woman was always there, standing in the corners of his vision, her gaunt, ghostly figure lingering just beyond his reach. She no longer appeared only in his dreams now, she haunted him even in his waking hours. Underscore, Jake, underscore, the voice hissed. Underscore, you know what you must do. It's the only way to end this, underscore. Jake stopped pacing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat hammering against his ribs. He could feel a cold breath on his neck again, like fingers of ice creeping up his spine. The scent of rot filled the room thick, overpowering, as if something had died and was decaying inside the walls. His hands trembled, his fingers twitching, itching to do something, anything, to stop the voices. But there was no escape. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to block out the noise, the commands, but it was no use. Her voice filled his head, swirling in his mind like a storm, pulling him down into the darkness. His thoughts twisted, mangled beyond recognition, and through it all, her words remained constant, relentless. Underscore, she's the reason, Jake. She's the one holding you back. She's in your way. You must do it, underscore. Jake's eyes flickered to the kitchen, where Emily was standing, her back turned as she washed the dishes. She hummed softly to herself, the gentle sound so out of place in the nightmare his life had become. Emily had been his anchor, his light in the storm that had taken over his mind, She had watched him spiral, seen him fall deeper into his madness, and yet she had stayed, she had loved him. Even as he became a man she no longer recognized. But now she was the enemy. Jake clenched his fists, his nails digging into the flesh of his palms until he drew blood. His breath came in shallow, erratic gasps as he stared at her, his mind buzzing with 1,000 voices, each one louder than the last. The voice of the woman, her voice was above the rest, sharp and commanding. She's the one keeping you from freedom, Jake. She's the one keeping me from you. Do it. Do it now, . His hand shook violently as he took a step forward, his eyes locked on Emily's back. The room seemed to blur around him, the edges of reality bending and twisting as his vision narrowed. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cold, hard stone he had kept from the shrine. The moment he touched it, a surge of something dark and powerful shot through him, like electricity coursing through his veins. He heard the laugh, then the woman's laugh, low, cruel, and echoing inside his skull. It reverberated through him, vibrating through his bones, filling him with a terrible exhilaration. He gripped the stone tighter, his knuckles white, his mind no longer his own. He was nothing but a puppet now, controlled by the dark force that had haunted him for weeks, manipulated by the spirit that had latched onto his soul. Do it, Jake. She has to die. Emily toned, wiping her hands on a towel, her eyes meeting his. She smiled at him, her face soft and kind, as if she couldn't see the monster standing before her. But Jake didn't see her anymore. He didn't see the woman he had once loved. All he saw was the enemy, the obstacle that stood in his way. The voices crescendoed, a deafening roar in his mind. His vision went red, and without another thought he lumped forward. The stone came down hard, striking Emily across the side of her head. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull, wet crack that echoed through the small kitchen. Emily's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying up to her head, blood already seeping between her fingers. She stumbled back, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, there was only a choked, guttural sound as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But Jake didn't stop. He brought the stone down again and again, each blow more violent than the last. Blood sprayed across the walls, across his face, across the floor, but Jake barely noticed. His mind had gone blank, consumed entirely by the need to finish what he had started. The voices cheered him on, urging him forward, pushing him deeper into the frenzy. Yes, Jake. Yes. This is what I wanted. This is what you needed. Emily's body crumpled to the floor, her limbs twitching, her eyes wide and unseeing. Blood pooled around her, dark and sticky, the life draining out of her with every passing second. But Jake didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was lost, drowning in the darkness that had taken hold of him. The stone slipped from his hand, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Jake stood over Emily's body, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He stared down at her, but it was as though he wasn't really seeing her. He was somewhere else, trapped in the twisted reality that had become his life. Then he heard it, the laugh. It started low, barely audible at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it filled the room, echoing off the blood-stained walls. The laugh was sharp and cruel, a sound that cut through Jake's mind like a blade. It was her laugh, the woman, the spirit, the thing that had haunted him since the shrine had been destroyed. She was here. She was with him. And she was laughing? Jake's body trembled, his blood-covered hands shaking violently as the sound of her laughter filled the room. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting to every corner, searching for her. But she wasn't there, not in the way he expected. She wasn't standing in the corner or lurking in the shadows. She was inside him. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with brutal force. She had been inside him all along, slowly taking control piece by piece until there was nothing left of the man he had once been. He had become her puppet, her instrument of destruction. He had killed Emily, his sweet, innocent Emily, because she had told him to. Jake collapsed to his knees beside Emily's lifeless body, his hands tangling in his hair as he let out a low, guttural scream. The reality of what he had done hit him all at once, like a sledgehammer to the chest. The blood, Emily's blood, was everywhere, soaking into his clothes, staining his skin, clinging to him like a second skin. He could still feel the warmth of it, could still smell the coppery scent that filled the air. But the worst part was the silence that followed the laugh. The house was deathly quiet now, the only sound the ragged gasps of Jake's breath as he knelt over his wife's body. The voices were gone. The woman was gone. And Jake was alone with the horror of what he had done, alone with the blood on his hands. He looked down at Emily, his vision blurring with tears. Her face, once so full of life, was now pale and bloodied, her eyes wide and vacant. She had been everything to him, and now because of the curse, because of the darkness that had taken over his soul, she was gone. The weight of it all was crushing. Jake's body shook with silent sobs, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. There was no going back now. He had crossed the line, done something unforgivable. He had become a murderer, driven by forces he could no longer control. And yet, somewhere deep in the recesses of his broken mind, Jake knew the truth. The woman's voice may have pushed him, may have urged him on, but the darkness, the madness had always been inside him, and now there was no escaping it. Part 8. The aftermath. The sun was barely beginning to rise when the first villagers saw it. A thin, pale ribbon of light crept over the horizon, casting a soft orange hue on the village's quiet streets. Everything seemed peaceful from a distance, the way it always did in the early morning hours before the day's toil began. But something was wrong, something air felt off, twisted, unnatural. It was Mrs. Green, the baker's wife, who came across Jake's house first. She had been on her way to fetch water from the well, her basket hanging loosely from her arm, her mind still foggy with sleep. The morning was cold, the wind biting at her cheeks, but that wasn't what made her pause. It was the door, Jake's door, which had been left open, swinging slightly on its hinges, as if inviting anyone in. That was odd. Jake was known for keeping to himself, especially after everything that had happened, the deaths, the whispers, the talk of curses. He had become something of a recluse in recent weeks, rarely leaving his home, barely speaking to anyone. The villagers had been wary of him, giving him a wide berth whenever he did appear. But leaving his door open like this, that wasn't like Jake. Mrs. Green hesitated for a moment, glancing around the empty street. Something cold slithered through her gut, a feeling she couldn't quite place, a sense that something was very, very wrong. She took a step closer to the door, peering into the dim interior of the house. "Jake," she called, her voice trembling slightly in the morning air. "Jake, are you in there?" No answer. Her feet carried her forward, against her better judgment. She hadn't planned to go inside, but there was a pull now, a morbid curiosity mixed with growing dread. The scent hit her first, thick, coppery, unmistakable. Blood. It clung to the air like a suffocating fog, growing stronger with every step she took. Her hand flew to her mouth, her stomach churning violently as she stepped into the house. And then she saw it. The kitchen was painted in blood, thick, dark smears of it covering the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It had soaked into the wooden boards, pooling in dark patches that glistened in the early morning light. But it wasn't the blood that made her scream, it was the body. Emily. Her lifeless form lay crumpled on the floor, her head at a strange, unnatural angle, her face barely recognizable beneath the blood that had caked onto her skin. Her eyes, once full of warmth and life, were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, frozen in the terror of her final moments. Her body was a mess of broken bones and gashes, each wound more brutal than the last. And then there was Jake. He sat in the corner of the room, his back pressed against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. His clothes were drenched in blood, his hands stained crimson, the stone he had used to kill her lying forgotten at his feet. But it wasn't the blood or the stone that sent chills down Mrs. Green's spine. It was the way Jake was rocking back and forth, his body moving in slow, rhythmic motions, his lips trembling as he muttered incoherently. Emily, Emily, she's gone. It wasn't me. I didn't want to. His voice was barely a whisper, cracking with emotion, his eyes wide and unfocused. He didn't seem to notice Mrs. Green standing there, didn't even register her presence. His mind was lost somewhere far away, trapped in the horror of what he had done. Mrs. Green backed away slowly, her hand still covering her mouth, her heart part pounding wildly in her chest. She stumbled out of the house, gasping for air, her vision swimming as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her down the street toward the center of the village, her voice finally finding its way out of her throat. Help, she screamed. Someone, help within minutes. The village was in chaos. People poured out of their homes, rushing toward Jake's house, drawn by the sound of Mrs. Green's frantic cries. The village elders were among the first to arrive, their faces grim as they approached the open door. They had known something like this was coming, had warned of it, but still, the reality was more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. Jake's house quickly filled with villagers, their horrified gasps and murmurs mixing with the scent of death that clung to the air. Emily's body lay in the center of it all, a brutal reminder of the evil that had been unleashed. Some of the women turned away, unable to bear the sight, while the men stood frozen, their faces pale, their hands trembling. And there, in the corner, was Jake. He hadn't moved since Mrs. Green had found him, still rocking back and forth, his eyes glazed over, his mind far away. His muttering had grown louder now, more frantic, the words spilling from his lips in a jumbled mess. I didn't want to. She made me do it. I didn't want to. The villagers stared at him, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. How had it come to this? How had a man like Jake, a man they had known for years, become this? But as they watched him, as they listened to his ramblings, the truth began to settle in. This wasn't Jake, not anymore. This was something else, something dark, something evil. The elders exchanged grim looks, their suspicions confirmed. The curse, the shrine, they had all warned against disturbing it, but no one had listened. And now this horror was a result. The village had awoken something from that shrine, something that had latched onto Jake and twisted him into this shell of a man. He's been possessed, one of the elders said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The spirit. It's taken him, the word sent a shiver through the crowd. Possessed. It wasn't a word they used lightly, but in this case there was no other explanation. The shrine had been sacred, a place of worship and fear, a place that had held something at bay for generations. When Jack and his men had torn it down, they had unleashed whatever had been trapped there. And now that darkness had claimed Jake as its own. What do we do? Someone whispered, their voice trembling. The elders were silent for a long moment, their faces drawn and pale. What could they do? The curse had already claimed its victims: Tom, Carl, Jim, and now Emily. And Jake. Jake was beyond saving. He was lost, trapped in a nightmare that none of them could reach. We must seal it, one of the elders finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. We must rebuild the shrine. It's the only way to stop this. The only way to end the curse, the villagers murmured among themselves, nodding in agreement. It was the only option they had left. But even as they spoke of rebuilding the shrine, their eyes kept drifting back to Jake, to the man who had once been their neighbor, their friend. He was still muttering to himself, rocking back and forth, his hands twitching in his lap, covered in blood. We can't leave him like this, someone said quietly. The village elder nodded slowly. No, we can't. Two of the men stepped forward, their faces grim, their hands trembling as they reached for Jake. He didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet, didn't fight as they led him out of the house. His body moved mechanically, his head hanging low, his eyes vacant. He didn't speak, didn't scream, didn't even cry. He was broken, hollowed out by the darkness that had consumed him. The villagers watched as he was taken away, their hearts heavy with a mix of fear and sorrow. They had known Jake all their lives, had grown up with him, laughed with him, walked alongside him. But the man they had known was gone, replaced by something else, something far more dangerous. As they began to clean up the remnants of the bloody scene, whispers spread through the crowd. There were murmurs of curses, of angry spirits, of the price that had to be paid for disturbing the sacred. The village had thought they could move forward, leave the old ways behind, but now they realized their mistake. Somewhere, in the depths of the earth, the dark spirit stirred. It had claimed Jake, and it was hungry for more. They had awakened something evil, and it wasn't finished yet. Part 9. The Cursed Land. The day of the burial was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as though even the earth had conspired to suppress any movement, any life in the village. The sky was overcast, blanketing the world in a suffocating grey. It wasn't raining, but the air felt wet and thick, oppressive in a way that made breathing feel like a chore. The villagers, all clad in black, moved slowly, mechanically, like shadows of themselves, carrying their grief like a weight they would never be able to put down. 4 fresh graves had been dug on the outskirts of the village, far enough away from the cursed ground to feel a small measure of safety. Emily, Tom, Carl, and Jim. Their names were now etched in stone, yet no one dared to speak them aloud. The memory of their brutal deaths, of the evil that had taken them, was too fresh, too raw. Words felt inadequate, hollow, compared to the terror that still clung to the village like a second skin. Jake's fate was another story altogether. He had not been buried with the others. The man who had once been their friend was now considered an abomination, a vessel tainted by something far worse than any earthly crime. The villagers couldn't bring themselves to bury him in consecrated ground. They couldn't risk it, not after what had happened. Instead, his body had been quietly taken to a remote corner of the forest, away from the village, away from the people he had once known. There his grave was shallow and unmarked, a nameless hole in the earth meant to be forgotten. But no one would ever truly forget. They couldn't. The village stood in silence as the last shovelful of dirt was thrown over the graves, the finality of it settling over them like a cold wind. The air was thick with tension, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional cough or the creak of wooden cartwheels in the distance. No one spoke and no one cried. There were no eulogies, no kind words about the departed. What could they say? What comfort could they offer in the face of such horror? The land itself felt different now. There was a darkness to it that hadn't been there before, an ominous presence that hung over everything like a shroud. It wasn't just the shrine, now reduced to a pile of crumbling stone and splintered wood. It was the whole village. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with something ancient, something angry. No one said it aloud, but they all knew the land was cursed. It had been poisoned by what they had unleashed, and it would never be the same. As the villagers began to walk back to their homes, their footsteps heavy, the tension in the air was palpable. No one dared look at the place where the shrine had once stood. It was now little more than a scar on the landscape, a gash in the earth that refused to heal. Some of the villagers still believed they could rebuild, that time and fate would eventually cleanse the village of its sins. But the elders knew better. They had seen the signs, felt the cold breath of the spirits on their necks. This curse would not be so easily undone. The whispers had already begun, spreading through the village like wildfire. People spoke of strange happenings, of shadows moving where no one stood, of cold spots in their homes, of the feeling that they were never truly alone. Some claimed to have seen the figure of a woman gaunt, hollow-eyed, standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. Others swore they heard her laugh, a low, cruel sound that sent chills down their spines. Fear gripped the village like a vice, tightening with each passing day. Children no longer played in the streets. The fields, once lush and full of life, had withered, the crops failing without explanation. Livestock became sickly and died, their bodies found bloated and stiff, their eyes wide with a terror that no one could explain. The village was rotting from the inside out, and no one knew how to stop it. The land had become a prison, trapping the villagers in a nightmare they couldn't escape. It wasn't just a physical decay, it was the way the village itself seemed to turn on them. Walls creaked and groaned in the dead of night, doors slammed shut with no wind to move them, windows shattered without reason. Every sound, every flicker of movement felt like a warning, a reminder that they were not alone. And then there were the dreams. At first, only a few people spoke of them, hesitant to admit what they had seen. But soon, it became clear that almost everyone in the village was being visited by the same haunting vision of a woman, pale and gaunt, with eyes as dark as the void. She stood in the ruins of the shrine, her skeletal hands reaching out to them, her mouth moving soundlessly. And though they couldn't hear her words, they all knew what she wanted. Revenge. Jake's death, Emily's death, the deaths of the other men who had destroyed the shrine, it hadn't been enough. The spirits that had been disturbed were not satisfied. They had been awoken, ripped from their rest, and now they demanded more. The villagers knew it deep in their bones, though none dared to say it aloud. They had tried to appease the spirits, had rebuilt the shrine as the elders had commanded, but it hadn't worked. The evil still lingered, festering in the ground beneath their feet. There was no escaping it. The village council, once a place of authority and reason, had become little more than a gathering of fearful whispers. The elders spoke of ancient rites, of rituals that might, just might, be enough to calm the spirits. But even they weren't sure. The curse had taken on a life of its own, a force that was beyond their control. Every attempt to cleanse the land had failed, and now the villagers were left with the grim realization that they were living on borrowed time. It was only a matter of when, not if, the curse would strike again. The nights were the worst. That was when the village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. No one went out after dark anymore. The streets, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, were now silent as the grave. Windows were barred, doors locked tight, but it did little to ease the fear that gripped the hearts of the villagers. They knew that locks and walls wouldn't stop what was coming. The spirits were already inside, lurking in the shadows, watching them as they slept, waiting for their moment. The woman's presence was everywhere. She wasn't just a ghost haunting the ruins of the shrine, she had become something more, something woven into the very fabric of the village. She was in the wind that rattled the shutters, in the creak of the floorboards at night, in the cold touch that brushed against their skin when no one was there. She was always there, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of reason. And the villagers were powerless against her. As the months passed, the village continued to decay, both physically and spiritually. Crops refused to grow, animals died without explanation, and the people themselves began to wither. Faces that had once been full of life were now hollow, gaunt, mirroring the visage of the woman who haunted their dreams. The land had turned on them, and there was no saving it. The elders tried one final ritual, gathering in the dead of night around the rebuilt shrine, their voices trembling as they chanted the old words, the words of protection and cleansing passed down through generations. But even as they spoke, they knew it was futile. The air was thick with a malevolent presence, a cold, suffocating force that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. The ground beneath the shrine rumbled, just slightly, enough to send a shiver through the gathered villagers. The chant faltered, their voices fading into the night. And then, from somewhere deep below, they heard it a laugh. Low, cold and cruel, echoing up from the earth like the whisper of death itself. The villagers fled, their hearts pounding in their chests, terror gripping their souls. The ritual had failed. The curse was too strong, too old, too deeply rooted in the land. And now, they knew for certain that the spirits would never rest. The village became a ghost town in the months that followed. One by one, families packed up their belongings and left, abandoning the homes they had lived in for generations. It wasn't safe anymore, not for them, not for their children. The spirits would never stop, and they couldn't stay to find out who would be taken next. By the end of the year, only a handful of the bravest or perhaps the most foolish remained. They lived in constant fear, haunted by the knowledge that the curse still lingered, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The shrine, once a place of reverence and fear, was now nothing more than a reminder of the evil that had been unleashed. The land was cursed and there was no undoing it. In the end, the village was left to rot, abandoned by those who had once called it home. The fields lay fallow, the houses crumbled, and the shrine stood as a silent sentinel over it all, watching, waiting. The curse had claimed its victims, but it wasn't finished. The spirits were still there, buried deep in the earth, biding their time, and one day they would rise again. Because curses never die, they only wait.